Ike had been the one responsible for hiring me, and this was in '67 when they were fighting to get an agricultural preserve in the Napa Valley, and it was to be the first big agricultural zoning in the state, 25,000 acres north of the town of Napa. And the preserve meant that, and it was recommended by the Planning Commission and was at that point before the Board of Supervisors.
And that was a new idea at that point.
It was a totally new idea. It was the first agricultural zoning in the state. It was a huge breakthrough when they got it. And they thought
they came up with the idea and hired...
Well, it was all, they'd come up with the idea a long time before. They'd gotten the county planning commission to support it and recommend an agricultural preserve. And then it was a big political fight and before the county board of supervisors. And that's when Ike had come and said, you know, would I be a lawyer for them? And the key guy doing it was Jack Davies, who hadn't made his first champagne, but he was a newcomer in the valley, and he had recruited Louis Martini, the old timer. But they were basically fighting the whole establishment, and specifically fighting Inglenook and Beaulieu, which were the great makers of Cabernet Sauvignon.
And why were those wineries against
Those guys wanted to sell out, and their vineyards were worth $3,000 an acre with grapes on them, but they were worth $6,000 or $10,000 as subdivisions. And Beaulieu had been sold to some larger company, and they figured they could plant grapes somewhere else, and they'd sell off the Napa Valley. And they had hired a high-paid lawyer around here who, I don't need to go into that, but anyway, he still lives in Tiburon, and he was getting up and making all these arguments, and because the other side had a lawyer, Davies and Martini and that group, which included Dorothy Erskine, not because she was a winemaker, but because she was a resident of the Napa Valley, and typical Dorothy, you know, the green foothills, green valleys, you know, keep it green. And I knew Dorothy. We've talked about that. So anyway, I got hired. And I remember the bill was $1,500 when it was finished. But the important thing is that I didn't do anything. I actually wrote a letter to the county saying there was no legal question about their ability to zone it. In fact, Davies was mad, I think, at the end that they paid me for doing nothing. But
did you do anything political?
Well, I did the smartest thing you could do, which is nothing. I let this lawyer on the other side get up and harangue the citizens of the Napa Valley. And the more he talked, the more angry they got, because he was lecturing them about this was socialism, this was whatever, you know. And it was just like the Save the Bay thing. You know, your dream is you get some lawyer on the other side that makes your case for him because it makes so many people angry. Well, that's what this guy was doing. And so I wasn't countering. You know, I get up for about a minute or two and say, there's no legal issue here. This is a decision to be made by the citizens of the Napa Valley. I remember at the final hearing before the Board of Supervisors, before the vote, two things happened. I got up and said, it's not up to someone from San Francisco. It's not up to a lawyer from San Francisco, which, by the way, included, of course, the other guy.
Right.
You don't need any lawyer from San Francisco telling you what you ought to do with your valley, which I said is applied to myself, but mostly is applied to him. But I said, all I'd comment is that through my youth, I used to drive through the Santa Clara Valley, and I saw how beautiful that place was with the plums and the apricots and all of that. And you all know what the Santa Clara Valley looks like now. And I said, if you want the Napa Valley to look like the Santa Clara Valley, go ahead and defeat this. But if you want to preserve this incredible place, blah, 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 blah.
So you made basically a political pitch.
I said, then you'll support this agricultural preserve. But the big deal we'd gone to dinner before the hearing, and I had said to Louis Martini, who I really liked, And he was a great friend of Carl Winnie, who was my great friend and had been in the Navy with me, and we'd been discharged together from Oregon State and all that. I said, Louis, a very shy man, but a guy with hands about as big as a catcher's mitt, you know, just the greatest looking man. And I said, Louis, you're the senior citizen up here. You know, Jack Davies, those are all newcomers. You've got to say something. Because people will pay attention. Well, I'm sitting next to him at the hearing, and I said, Louis, he says, okay. He'd never opened his mouth before about this whole thing in public.
But you knew how he felt.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I had no idea what he was going to say. So he stands up, and I can remember it just so well. The punchline was, he goes on, he says, you know, you're selling out what our grandfathers gave to us, our birthright. He said, for a few bucks. He said, our grandfathers got this land for $50 an acre, and they farmed it. And he's talking to the Beaulieu and the Inglenook people, mostly. And he says, and you want to sell it out for just a few bucks. He says, we're already doing fine. He says, we're not poor. Our land's worth $3,000 an acre. We got it for $50 an acre. He said, how can we do this? He said, our grandparents would be rolling over in their graves. Well, I forget the rest of it, but it was very short. And he came back and he says, Lou, how did I do? You found this out before. I'm sitting there with these little trickles coming down my face. Because Louis Martini, I mean, he's done everything. Yeah. He's done, I mean, I couldn't have made that speech, and I mean, I couldn't have made the speech even if I had a grandparent up there.
Right.
But so Louis does that. And very shortly, the board votes 4-0 for the agricultural preserve. And people, I mean, I can't believe it. None of us can believe it. We knew what the pressure was that these board members wanted. By the way, after that, one of the board members of the Board of Supervisors that had, and he'd been under attack all along in this thing, he had an insurance business. He lost a huge amount of his clients. They just boycotted him.
You mean the newer wineries that wanted to sell out?
Well, I don't know, or just citizens. The citizens, you know, because we were accused of being communists, or the good guys were accused of being communist, socialists. I mean, literally, that was that kind of language. It was the same sort of language you heard over the Save the Bay. You know, any land use planning was communism or something. And so, after the decision, this one guy, I remember his, I think before the vote, his wife and children had been harassed by people at their house yelling at him because they were suspected he was going to vote for this thing. I mean, it was enormous pressure. I think 2 of the supervisors later lost their jobs. I forget the details.
So the community was...
It took enormous guts because a lot of the substantial people in the community didn't want it.
Didn't want the preserve.
Didn't want the agricultural preserve.
Now, when you say substantial people, you mean landowners who wanted...
Landowners who wanted to sell their land, people that were just right-wing, that didn't believe in any government messing around with land decisions. You know, I mean, remember, this is 1967 or 68, I forget.
It sounds somewhat similar to some of the things out at Point Reyes when they wanted the park
well,
there,
that was
it was a smaller scale, maybe.
Well, yeah, but this, you know, nobody was paying for this land. Remember, it was being zoned. I mean, in Point Reyes, and those guys sold out for a lot of money to the state, to the national park. I mean, that's when Ed Wayburn, with BCDC, they got the Trust for Public Land to tie up all that money, because anytime anybody saw a national park coming, they made, you know, suddenly the value of their land went up about 3 times. But nobody was getting paid for anything. I mean,
it was just a zoning.
This was just a zoning. And of course, it was the first agricultural zoning. It saved the Napa Valley. That Cabernet Sauvignon land that that was worth $3,000 an acre is now 150,000 to 200,000. You know the whole story.
Yeah.
And those people were great heroes, and I was just this sort of tag along to tell them they didn't need a lawyer. Well, the bill was, they'd paid me $750, and then I got a note from Dorothy Erskine saying, Lou, I'm sorry, we haven't got enough money. I guess she was the treasurer to pay you, but we're going to raise the money for the other $750. So that 4th of July, they had a 4th of July party, which I guess is a tradition up there. And they passed the hat and raised $750. Jack Davies, I think, was still dead against it because he didn't think I'd done anything. And so I ended up with the $1,500. So that was my contact with Ike Livermore. And, you know, looking back on it, I literally didn't add anything to what they were doing. Fortunately, I didn't subtract either, and the lawyer on the other side subtracted. So,
well, that's an interesting slant on it.
But that and the Dos Rios Dam were the big deals, and so those are the three things: that BCDC, the Napa Valley, and or say the Bay, the Napa Valley, and the Dos Rios Dam.
Were your three big?
Were the three big things
of the Butler
and
law
that
firm.
was that. And then I went to Washington, and that was the end of Butler and McCloskey.